I haven't done any H.G. Wells reviews for a little while. We've been very busy with other things, one big part of which has been remodeling this room for me to use for basically my office and recording these videos. So I wanted to get back to H.G. Wells because that is my home. And The Crystal Egg by H.G. Wells, which I first read in a collection called Empire of the Ants and Other Stories by H.G. Wells that was published as a tie-in to the release of the Empire of the Ants movie in, I think it was 1978. Not a good movie. Book was good though. It was a good collection of some of Wells' best short stories. That was a paperback. So one of the earliest that I read, one of his earliest short stories, I previously read novels. Crystal Egg was one of the first short stories I ever read by H.G. Wells. And I found a lot more of his stories in this book, 28 science fiction stories, published by Dover Books. This was in all the libraries, school library, public library. There were copies of it. It was pretty easily available, and it's a big, good collection of H.G. Wells' best short stories. Unfortunately, Dover doesn't publish this anymore. I wish they would bring it back. It's one of my all-time favorite books. I didn't like the dust cover, though. I don't do that very often. I almost never do that, throw dust covers away, but this one was awful. So I tossed it. I like just the plain blue cover better. Anyway, The Crystal Egg. Published first in a magazine called The New Review in May of 1897. Now, at the same time, War of the Worlds was being serialized in Pearson's starting in April 1897 and lasting until December 1897. So the two stories are often seen as connected, and they might have started out being connected, but I don't think in the end that H.G. Wells considered them to be part of the same story or part of the same fictional universe. I think he saw them as two separate stories. Yeah. The story opens with two gentlemen looking in the window of a shop. It's like a resale shop, kind of like Goodwill or St. Vincent de Paul, but privately owned. And the proprietor, Mr. Cave, they go in and ask him how much he wants for it, for this crystal egg they see in the window. Mr. Cave first says £5, which is a huge amount back then. And the gentlemen are willing to spend it. So right away, Mr. Cave says, oh, but he promised it to somebody else. Reality is he doesn't really want to sell it. So he gets rid of the two gentlemen, and he takes the egg to an investigator friend of his, Mr. Wace, and relates to Mr. Wace what he saw. And the rest of the story is about the visions in the egg. First, he notices that the egg is glowing in the dark. And when he stares at the egg more intently in just the right light, he starts to see a landscape. Now, if you've never read this story, this is where you should stop, because from here on out, I'm spoiling it. It's just a short story, less than 20 pages. So I can't really review this much without telling you what happens. So if you don't want it spoiled, stop here, but know that I recommend this story. I think it's one of the greatest short stories ever written, and I definitely think you should check this story out. And it's on our Telltale Top Tales list. So it turns out this egg is kind of like a communication device, almost like a video device. And it's showing Mr. Cave a vision of what works out, or at least he assumes, because how does he really know? He thinks he's looking at Mars. And he's seeing these strange flying bat-like creatures with big eyes, and he's seeing buildings, and he's seeing these other large elephant-sized creatures, and one of the creatures flies up to whatever he's looking through on Mars and looks back at him. Wells' imagination in this story is brilliant. And of course, it's the typical H.G. Wells little common guy, working class guy, suddenly being confronted with extraordinary events and situations. And how does he react? Wells was a master of that, and he was a master at building the mystery. The way he structured his story led you gradually to understand what was happening, but nothing was revealed right away. You had to read the whole story to really get the point. And well, by the time you started getting to the point, you were hooked in the story. Wells was great that way. Brilliant writer in that manner. So, having been published in the middle of serializing War of the Worlds, it must have been written pretty much concurrently with War of the Worlds. It's led a lot of people to speculate that this is kind of the same universe as War of the Worlds, the same Mars. It's like a tie-in to War of the Worlds. And I suppose it's possible that Wells started writing The Crystal Egg as a first chapter of War of the Worlds before the Martians actually invade. But the Martians in Crystal Egg are way different from the Martians in War of the Worlds. So I don't think, if it was like that, Wells abandoned the idea and set that aside and wrote the War of the Worlds as we know it, and then went back and revisited that piece and turned it into a separate story. But the story is brilliant. It's great. It's one of the, like I say, it's one of the first science fiction stories I read. It's one of the first H.G. Wells short stories that I read. And rereading it today, it's just as fresh, just as mysterious, just as amazing, just as cool, just as much wonder, just as much imagination, even though I know what's going to happen. So it's all the best things that a short story can be, which in my book makes it one of the greatest short stories ever written. Like I say, this is a Telltale's Top Tale. I recommend it if you want a really great early classic science fiction short story, one that you can read probably for most people hour to an hour and a half. This is your story. So now I gotta get back to reading some more H.G. Wells so I can do more of these. And I'll see you next time.